The first full army rules of Warhammer 40K 10th edition are upon us, so let's talk through the forces of the Great Devourer and how the Tyranids will be playing in the new game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're going to be doing a full review of Index Tyranids, the bugs from beyond truly taking centre stage in the new Warhammer 40k. It's definitely an exciting time to be a Tyranid player with a whole bunch of new units in the mix, the prospect of a few more coming with the Codex, and being centre stage in the galaxy as you try and claw your way towards Terra. In this review we're going to be talking through the entirety of Warhammer 40k Index Tyranids, and for our rules for the Hive fleets we get these. The full faction rules for Synapse and Shadow in the Warp that every single Tyranid army will be getting, the initial launch detachment called the Invasion Swarm, a balanced Tyranid force that goes all in for its adaptations, plus have 6 interesting stratagems and 4 enhancements for characters. Then of course we've got the massive amount of datasheets for the Tyranid army. There's a fair few new entries for the various units for Leviathan, a few that have been shifted around, and quite a few that have just been removed wholesale, consolidated into other units. At this point we're still waiting on a few things like the combat patrol and the points cost for the units, but we can get a pretty good idea as to how the forces are going to be playing. Starting out, we've got the army rules that the Tyranids will gain no matter which detachment they have, Synapse and Shadow in the Warp. Synapse represents the Tyranids' spooky control over their lesser organisms. Previously it's often made them fearless, but now in the age of Battle Shock that's very rarely ever the case. The rule is now that you have to test Battle Shock on 3d6 inches rather than 2d6 if you're within 6 inches of a Tyranid Synapse unit. That makes it a lot easier to pass the test as you're likely to roll higher than the value. Most non-Synapse Tyranids are now leadership 8+, and the extra dice roll really does significantly reduce the chance of failing. It decreases you from around about a 59% chance to fail it down to just a 17% chance. It definitely will be a good idea to maintain this in the core of the army if you don't want your models battle shocked. Depleted units might struggle to hold objectives and things. There are a few units that can manipulate it a bit, the Neuro Tyrants perhaps being a particularly good example. Otherwise, their second special rule also focuses on the battle shock mechanic. Shadow in the Warp is a once per game debuff that happens in the command phase. You can choose either player's command phase, but it will make more sense to select the enemy one normally, as that's when they're just about to score their objectives, plus it could hamper them throughout their turn if they want to fall back or use any stratagems on their units. That usually isn't going to be the case so much if you trigger it in yours. It's really quite a powerful rule, though maybe a little bit scattergun as to how it applies. A lot of enemy units will just pass that leadership check anyway, but a lot will fail. It is kind of interesting that as it doesn't technically work in the battle shock phase of the command phase, you can't actually use the insane bravery stratagem to counter it, which is kind of powerful. I feel like it's likely to be a good one to trigger when the forces are maximally engaged but quite early in the game. Turn 2 might often be a good time. It'll definitely impact some armies more than others though, the lower leadership ones fearing this a lot more. Moving on, the launch detachment is called the Invasion Swarm. This is your slightly more balanced Tyranid force to get you going, and this kind of feels very Leviathan in flavour I think with the adaptations. There's no restrictions on any units that you can field, and it grants this rule 6 stratagems and 4 enhancements. The Hyper Adaptations rule is a choice of 3 different rules: Swarming Instincts, Hyper Aggression, or Hive Predators, all basically keying off critical hits against the enemy, either sustained hits 1 versus infantry and swarm targets, lethal hits versus monsters and vehicles, or critical hits become precision hits, so any 6s that you roll will basically be able to target enemy leaders even if they're hiding within a squad. You get to choose which one of these buffs that you get for your entire army at the start of the game. I think it will be usually quite easy to choose if they're either all monsters and vehicles or all infantry and swarms. In a more balanced force you might have to try and gauge which ones are going to give you the most problems. Sustained hits is usually going to be either plus 33% or plus 25% damage against those. Lethal hits is generally a bit tame if you're already wounding things on a 3+, but against tough monsters and vehicles you might often be wounding on a 5 or worse. That's to be an extra 50% damage there, which is nice. And I feel like the precision hits one is maybe a tiny bit more niche, but I guess if you've got an enemy army that's got an absolute ton of leaders that you need to kill, then all well and good. Overall looks like a solid enough faction rule. It is kind of weird though that things like mounted and cavalry type units get a bit of a free pass against this. None of your rules will really affect them all that much. I do quite like the flavour of it though. It was one particularly popular bit of the previous Tyranid Codex. There's something a bit spooky about an army that adapts to your given force, particularly if your tactics or army composition is too predictable perhaps. Next up we've got Stratagems, there's 6 of these, and first for 1 CP we've got Rapid Regeneration. This one I really like, 1 command point for a 5+ feel no pain on any Tyranid's unit that was just attacked, but only a 6+ if you're not within Synapse range. This is an absolutely excellent start to the stratagems. Usually on big tough monsters, it's going to be a plus 50% durability boost, maybe a little bit more questionable on small hordes, particularly if they're getting hit by damage to weapons or worse. It really just is a great durability stratagem though. Typically you'd want to target on things that are within synapse range, yet another good reason to maintain the web. If you've got a critical Tyranid unit, it's going to be far harder to kill. Also for one command point, we've got Death Frenzy as well. This one's fights on death for a 4+ for any Tyranid unit. You declare it when your opponent attacks your Tyranid unit, so not when they actually die. Can mean that you need to gauge if they're actually going to take some heavy casualties or not, and they can only do this if they haven't already fought. If you've got a unit that's clearly just going to be swept by an enemy unit, and they can actually do some meaningful damage back though, this seems like really quite a solid investment for 1 CP. Tyranids have got plenty of dangerous melee units, this can drag down some of the foe with them. Next up for 2 command points we've got Adrenal Surge. This one's a more pricey one and it gives you a bonus to your critical hits. You get critical hits on a 5+ rather than a 6+, and it can either apply to 2 Tyranid units that are within synapse range or 1 unit that's outside it. There seems to be quite a common theme of keeping up synapse to buff your stratagems. I think the main benefit of this is usually going to be triggering the hyper adaptation rules a bit better. It basically makes any of the invasion swarm abilities twice as good as they were before. Lethal hits on a 5+, not a 6, and the same for sustained hits or character targeting. You can only use it in melee, so you can't use it quite as predictably to amp up 2 really big different guns. I think it is potentially pretty powerful and could get you a pretty interesting damage buff at the drop of a hat, but I would say that 2 command points is a little bit on the pricey side. For 1 command point next, we've got Overrun. This one allows you to consolidate 6 inches after your unit has fought, or just normal move 6 inches if you're within synapse and not in engagement range. Both of these are useful, I think. The consolidate could be useful to jump into another enemy unit and tie them up for next turn. If you ever find a unit like that and it shuts down some enemy guns, then that could be well worth a command point. The normal move, I guess, could be handy to perhaps get a unit safe behind cover perhaps, or if it gives you enough movement to just stretch out to an objective before the next command phase. Perhaps a tiny bit on the niche side, but still very usable. Getting a whole bunch of extra movement in the fight phase is really quite handy. Synaptic Insight costs 1 command point. This one gives you 1 extra hyper adaptation chosen in your command phase for a unit, and it lasts until the end of the battle round. Again, this one is one that allows you to target 2 different units if you're within synapse range, or just the 1 if you're not. For 1 command point, I think this could be pretty useful. I guess you want to target something really quite big and scary, like a dangerous hive tyrant in combat, or a massive Tyrannifex shooting perhaps. Maybe it could be big to flex into that precision one if you think there's a good chance of sniping an enemy character with some attacks with massive damage output, or just another option for a damage buff against infantry or vehicles if you don't happen to have that as your primary adaptation. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Endless Swarm. Really quite a simple, predictable and useful one this. You can regenerate D3+3 models from depleted units of Gaunts, and rather than just 1 like the previous version of this stratagem, now you can target 2 different units with this, really flooding the board with extra termagants if your opponent leaves more than 1 unit injured. This one does seem really quite solid. It's absolutely definitely usable even if you can only target 1 unit with it. Respawning a bunch of termagants with both this and a Tervagon is very nice indeed, and it also happens in the command phase, so you could do some shenanigans with these, maybe placing them on objectives to try and snag their points, or maybe if you were regenerating some Hormagaunts like this, you could put them at the front of the squads to shorten their charge later in the turn. Overall, I think it's a fairly solid set of stratagems. Pretty much all of them very nice to have. I feel like that 1 command point for the 5+ Feel No Pain is pretty excellent value there. Endless Swarm, when you can use it, is just predictable extra value added to the board with more objective control models. Synaptic Insight and Adrenal Surge both are pretty decent ways of manipulating your core army mechanic, and Overrun and the Fights and Death one I think won't always come up, but in the right situation they have the potential to be very strong indeed. My first guess is that Endless Swarm and the Feel No Pain will probably wind up being staples, though all of them are strong. Next up we've got Enhancements, and there's 4 of these. Alien Cunning is one to allow you to redeploy units. You redeploy 3 units and you can put them in strategic reserve if you want to. Though it looks like from the timing of this is a little bit weaker than some of the 9th edition versions, as it happens after the deploy armies step rather than after you know who's going first. Maybe a little bit less powerful than it was as a result, as it means that you can't just perfectly counter your opponent's army by moving things that you know are either going to be in range or hidden. It's still potentially powerful, but maybe not quite as auto-include as it was before maybe. Perfectly Adapted gets your character or monster a single reroll per turn. There's a short list here of things that you can use it for: rerolling a hit roll, wound roll, damage roll, advance roll, charge or saving throw. I'd say it might be most reliably powerful on tanking saves on 4+ invul units, particularly versus big shots like las cannons. In your own turn you can use it for a bit more damage, maybe things like charges or wound rerolls. They might be kind of nice. Not hugely game changing, but if it's cheap enough then that could add a little bit more raw power to a Hive Tyrant or something. Next up we've got Synaptic Linchpin, boosted synapse range out to 9 inches, handy enough to have given that so many rules rely on synapse, but I would feel that this one would probably have to be at least fairly cheap to make it worth it, otherwise maybe just include more synapse units and not bother with this. Finally we've got Adaptive Biology, again this one's really good I think, feel no pain 5+, going up to a big 4+ at the start of the turn whenever a bearer is injured. As with a stratagem, just getting a 5+ feel no pain straight out is really quite crazy. As with a stratagem, it's just plus 50% durability, and it's not just for the turn, this is all game long. Doesn't say that it couldn't be taken by something like a Turvagon either, which is kind of cool. You could absolutely have an enormously tanky big monster with this one. And getting the 4+ feel no pain on the remaining wounds is pretty amazing. That's literally double durability compared with what you would have had otherwise. How much value these ones add depend on how many points cost they'll be. I'd probably say the single best one again is the Adaptive Biology, just adding raw extra tankiness to the army and quite a lot of it. All the rest are kind of fine provided they're cheap enough though. Next up we get into datasheets, and there have been a fair few things that have been shifted around here. It looks like Tyranids do indeed have some battle line units. It was a bit weird that in the Leviathan datasheet drop, the Termagants didn't have that for some reason. Fortunately they do now, so you can still spam a Gaunt Hordes to your heart's content. Termagants, Hormagaunts and Gargoyles all get battle line, but interestingly enough not Warriors, Genestealers or Neurogaunts. They can still field a fairly decent amount of Warriors as they've been split into 2 datasheets, one with ranged weapons and one with melee weapons. Perhaps a little bit of an unusual choice that one. Might have partly been so they can be 2 different units with 2 different abilities, as opposed to just sharing one. Otherwise a few units seem to have disappeared. The Neurothrope is just back to being a Zoanthrope squad leader now. He's not his own independent psyker anymore. The Tyranid Prime is just a warrior squad leader now. The only independent Prime character that you can field is the Winged Prime right now. The Trigon Prime was an HQ version of the Trigon in 9th edition, now it's just represented by the regular Trigon datasheet as well, and kind of similar as happened to the Thornback Carnifex. I'd perhaps argue that that one had limited use of being its own independent datasheet in the first place. It looks like they'll now be represented as Carnifexes with the same war gear. Otherwise, Leviathan's brought a whole bunch of new or resculpted units, the Neurotyrant and the Winged Prime, Von Ryan's Leapers, Barbgaunts and Neurogaunts, plus the Psychophage. Finally, in trends throughout the datasheets, as with quite a lot of 10th edition, a few melee weapons are being consolidated together, and a few Tyranid upgrades like Toxin Sacs and Adrenal Glands are basically seem to have been removed as options. I guess maybe Adrenal Glands is supposed to be represented by that Adrenal Surge Stratagem. A little bit of unit customization lost there. 10th edition does tend to focus a lot more on the raw datasheets rather than small points upgrades. Let's get into the main datasheets then, and first up we have the battle line units. Here we've got the Termagants, having their very nice new miniatures. Glad to have them confirmed as battle line. That means that you can spam up to 120 of them. You can take 10 to 20 models in the units down from their previous 30. Again, that does look like it's something that could be quite common throughout 10th. I'd be surprised if we get any units that you can field above 20 models. Their stats are broadly unchanged. They're still toughness 3 with their 5+ chitin, and their objective control 2, so it'll be quite annoying to scrape off points. For their weapons, the Flesh Borer loses AP but retains the Assault keyword, still hitting with a bunch of Strength 5 hits. Devourers are 2 shots at Strength 4 out to 18 inches, and Spine Fists actually look kind of interesting. 2 shots with twin-linked Assault and Pistol, all at Strength 3. If they all wind up being the same points cost, I would guess that Devourers and Spine Fists probably outcompete the Flesh Borer against most targets. I think I'd be more tempted by one of them just for raw damage output if they wind up costing the same. Their datasheet rule is Skulking Horrors, which is the one where if an enemy moves within 9 inches, you can then move your Termagants D6 inches. Movement shenanigans in the enemy turn are rather nice. You could hide them or jump them onto an objective or something else. Should be a good unit to replenish between Endless Multitudes and Tervagons. Next up we've got the Hormagaunts, also battle line and similarly 10 to 20 models now. Again like the Termagants, broadly unchanged on the stat line, still having a big 10-inch move and a 5+ save. Their melee is also pretty similar with 3 attacks hitting on a 4, strength 3 and AP -1. I guess having a bit of AP isn't too bad. Unless they're in very big numbers though, they might struggle to threaten medium infantry, let alone heavy stuff or tanks. It seems that their Bounding Leap has been reimagined as a built-in advance and charge now. You could now be moving Hormagaunts up to 16 inches in the movement phase before charging. The average charge threat range is 21 inches, which is pretty crazy for on-foot infantry. Seems pretty solid, they'll be able to rush midfield objectives really quite quickly. They might not be carrying the army in damage. Next up we've got the Gargoyles. These also have battle line and are 10 to 20 models in the units, and again are pretty similar to their previous incarnation, moving 12 with fly and only have a 6+ save, so a bit easier to kill as a trade-off, but still pretty awesome for taking objectives with their objective control too. They've taken the same flesh borer change as the Termagants. Their blinding venom doesn't really seem to do anything different besides regular Termagant claws, and their datasheet rule is a move shoot move called Winged Swarm. Provided you've shot something in the shooting phase, you can then make a normal move of 6 inches, so potentially these guys could be zooming around 18 inches per turn while still firing, or potentially if they do get safe on an objective or something, popping out, taking some pot shots and ghosting back out of line of sight. That'll make them a little bit more annoying to deal with, and they've gained some innate deep strike again after they lost it in 9th edition for a little bit. It'll be nice to have them swooping down from the sky once more. Neurogaunts next, and these guys aren't battle line despite being gaunts. It does seem that they're living up to their lore as being sort of auxiliary organisms parasitized by another Tyranid creature. You can actually field these guys in very slightly bigger hordes, 10 to 20 models of the regular Neurogaunts, but you also get 1 node beast if you've got 10 or 2 node beasts if you have 20. The node beasts, despite looking a bit cooler, don't really seem to have any extra rules though. Their stat line really is truly weedy though, a toughness 3 with a 6+ save, so all the bad defense of gargoyles, but not really getting any particularly decent aggressive weapons. Their purpose in life is mainly just to tank hits for a bigger Tyranid creature. Looks like it's only the Neuro Tyrant that can join them though, so I guess they'll be running alongside him most of the time and tanking damage for him. As they do so, they also have the advantage of pushing Synapse out a bit further. If they're within Synapse range themselves, then they also get the Synapse keyword too. It maybe could be another easy way to have it running through your army, or another horde of units that you don't really want to be firing your guns at because they aren't very good. Hopefully they wind up being a little bit cheaper than the other flavours of Gaunts. Tyranid Warriors have had their datasheet split into 2 different ones. There's one with ranged bioweapons, which is this one, and one with melee ones. The ones with ranged bioweapons get a gun and then a basic melee weapon profile. Even that isn't too terrible though, they do get 5 attacks at strength 5 and AP -1, so can certainly put a bit of damage on some light or medium infantry. Both flavours of Tyranid Warriors aren't battle line despite being troops in the previous codex. I guess you can still field 6 units of them between the 2 different flavours. The squad size has dropped a bit though, it's down to 3 to 6 models per unit, previously it was 9. Weapons wise, like quite a lot of things in 10th edition, a lot of AP's been lost. The Death Spit has lost a little bit of AP, the Devourer's unchanged basically, the Spine Fist seem kind of poor by comparison. Otherwise the Barb Strangler basically gains an extra shot, so maybe that's a tiny bit more tempting than it was before. The Venom Cannon strength 9 but lost an extra AP. I feel like they're a unit that's going to not like the loss of toxin sacs and adrenal glands and things like that. They could be quite efficient on really quite big stacked up warrior units before. And their datasheet special rule is called Adapt to All Predators. This one allows them to fall back, shoot and charge, so it has them quite well suited to being on the front line without having to give up any of their ranged damage output. They are Synapse as well of course, and that's going to have some extra value when leading the swarm into battle. Their counterparts are the ones with melee weapons, broadly a fairly similar stat line and profile to the last ones. Their datasheet is a lot more simplified though, and you just get the single set of bioweapons. These ones get 6 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1, so more attacks and more AP, but they also gain twin links over the other ones as well, and that will definitely help them out quite a lot at punching up against slightly tougher targets like anything below toughness 10. While it's a bit sad to lose specific rules for things like bone swords, lash whips and scything talons and things, maybe just for gameplay's sake it might not be the worst in the world, saves people either having to magnetize their models kind of nightmarishly, or wind up being modelled with suboptimal loadouts. Rather than getting the fallback and shoot and charge thing, they get a buff in their fight phase that they can choose which one they'd like, either reroll hit rolls of 1 if they just want to hit the enemy extra hard, or a bit of extra defense with an unusual reroll saves of 1 mechanic. I'd probably usually go for the damage unless you think the unit's just going to get wiped out. Rerolling saves is going to have some slightly limited value though, unless you're saving on your 4+ and the enemy's attacking with AP 0. Moving on to the other Tyranid squads, next up we have the Tyrant Guard, 3 to 6 models per squad, and their stats have shifted a little bit, going up to toughness 8, so a bit more resilient against bolters and small arms, but also dropping in save a little bit, down from a 2+ save to a 3. Broadly speaking, I feel like they do pretty much the same thing as they did before. Their melee weapons seem kind of similar, the crushing claws hit a little bit worse now, so a bit less of a flat upgrade there. and they're basically a unit that can be led by the Foot Tyrant, the Swarm Lord, or the Neuro Tyrant, and while the character is leading that unit, they also get a 5+ Feel No Pain as well. Usually not going to be very relevant at all, but I guess it gives them just some extra insurance against being sniped by precision attacks. Not usually going to come into effect, but could be fun when it does. The Winged Hive Tyrant not being able to use them anymore, I think is a bit of a blow for him. Quite a big investment model without quite as much insurance against getting shot. Next we've got the Lictor, maybe kind of unsurprisingly a single model unit with lone operative and stealth. You can't shoot this outside of 12 inches, kind of similar to how it was before. Though it looks like its deployment options have shifted a bit, it no longer deep strikes with the potential for close range ambushes. It now has the Infiltrator's keyword to set up in the midfield, but it also looks like if you set it up in Strategic Reserve, you get to use the Rapid Ingress Stratagem for 0 CP. I'd guess infiltrating would often be the way to go, that way he's less likely to get screened on the board edges. Stats wise, he's a little bit tougher on his base stats, toughness 6 and 6 wounds, but he has lost 2-inch move down to 8 inches from 10. He still gets his 5+ invul save for unnatural reflexes jumping out the way. Otherwise, his melee attacks are kind of similar again, strength 7 and damage 2 and decent AP, quite good at killing elite infantry. But on top of that, he also gains precision, so he could be good as a character assassin, particularly nice against Space Marines I think. And he also has the Fights First keyword as well, which means that if you charge him, usually you're going to get the chance to select this guy before enemy charges get to fight. Definitely makes him hard to kill in melee that. He could certainly drag down a bunch of enemy models before he goes. Overall seems kind of fun, nice and disruptive, though quite a lot of special rules might mean that he's paying a bit of a points cost premium for it. In 10th edition, Lictors also brought along their little friends as well, Von Ryan's Leapers. These guys basically feel like squad hunting Lictors in 3 to 6 models. They don't get any weapons options or anything like that, but do generally have some pretty similar special rules to their bigger Lictors, Fights First, Infiltrators and Stealth, though they don't get the lone operative protection against shooting, so they can get shot from longer range. Otherwise they move pretty quickly at 10 inches, reasonably tough at toughness 5, 3 wounds and a 4+ save, basically the same as a Tyranid warrior there, and in combat they may be a little bit more suited to downing hordes of infantry, 6 attacks at strength 5, AP -1 and damage 1, perhaps a surprising amount of volume attacks from single models. Their special rule is Pouncing Leap. This one gets you free heroic intervention in the fight phase, 0 CP for that normally 2 CP stratagem, though if they are infiltrating towards the enemy, I feel like it's kind of rarely going to come up. They just might not have all that many units that they're all that close to. Overall though, they do feel like the sort of unit that you kind of want on a midfield objective and trying to skirmish with enemy units trying to take it earlier on in the game. They definitely feel like they could bully enemy infantry and hordes pretty well, and also aren't super easy to kill as well. I feel like they will probably be directly competing with the Lictor for that kind of role. Next up we've got the Toxic Miasma that are the Venomthropes. 3 to 6 models per unit, again broadly kind of similar to how they were before. Fairly similar durability and anti-infantry melee with those toxic lashes. They lose a little bit of AP but gain anti-infantry 2+. It does mean that they're a little bit more focused though, they're not going to be good against monsters or mounted things. They did lose a wound on their stat line as well, which means that they will be a bit easier to kill with damage 3 weapons. Their new Spore Cloud rule is quite a good one though. When Tyranids units are within 6 inches, they now get the benefit of cover against ranged attacks. That's really quite nice for big monstrous creatures in particular with a 2+ save. Worsening anti-tank AP is nice. For smaller swarms, anything that isn't a monster also gets the stealth keyword as well, so -1 to hit at range there. Between the two, that's some really solid durability boosting. Sounds like perhaps the optimal targets of them to buff are things like infantry with some fairly high saves, maybe things like Hive Guard, Pyrovores or Tyranid warriors perhaps. Kind of like before, I feel like they're a unit that you might want just one set of. That means that you could shield a lot of the army with those special rules, and maybe even hide them out of line of sight while doing so. Next up we've got Gene Stealers. These 4 armed horrors aren't battle line, so no reversion to the troops' battlefield role as they had in editions past. They saw quite a few changes in the last Tyranid Codex, and I feel like a lot of their stats have moved on again. They still move 8 inches and are quite fast, and they still strike with a whole flurry of attacks hitting on good weapon skill. They now hit at strength 4, AP -2, damage 1, so lost a tiny bit of AP there. Probably the most surprising thing on the datasheet though is they're now really quite a lot tougher. They're now 2 wounds rather than 1 wound, and that's going to be quite a big deal with them actually surviving places rather than just getting shot off the board fairly easily, as often tends to be their reputation. In the previous Tyranid book they had infiltrators, but now they're scouts with an 8-inch pre-game move. Perhaps not the worst trade-off, definitely helpful for mid-game board control, could be deployed alongside some Von Ryan's Leapers maybe to ensure that they're not screened out with that scout move. Otherwise for changes, they also lost their 4+ invul and melee, now it's just the 5+1 at range, and also their spawning mechanic that was a little bit fiddly with their infestation node. Their special unit rule is called Vanguard Predator. This one's one of the ones that takes aim at units on objectives. Whenever they attack, they can reroll wound rolls of 1, but if you attack a unit that's on an objective marker, you get to reroll all the wound rolls. Pretty huge damage boosts there, particularly with low strength weapons, and even more so if you have a Brood Lord in the unit, as he gives them devastating wounds. Definitely seems like a unit that could just rush in and just churn an enemy unit off a point. Next up, Terrors from Below with the Raveners. 3 to 6 models in this unit. They lost a wound compared with the 4 that they had before, so they're now down the same as Warriors again, and they're also just a tiny bit slower as well with a 10-inch move rather than 12. Their melee isn't so very different from the Warriors with the twin sets of melee weapons. 7 attacks at strength 5, AP -1 and damage 1, again with the twin links rule. Not quite as much AP, but 1 additional hit. They've still got the option for a mini thorax bio weapon. This one's now 3 shots, hitting at strength 4, AP 0, damage 1, though it does lack the pistol rule, so you can't fire it in combat now. They still have deep strike, and their unit special rule is death from below. At the end of your opponent's turn, if this unit isn't within engagement range, then you can remove it from the battlefield and place it into your strategic reserves. As that happens at the end of your opponent's turn, I guess that means that you can just have them turn up in your turn once more at the edges of the board. Really quite a generous redeploy type mechanic there. It means that you're not waiting for an entire turn of them off the board or anything like that. You can just literally have them disappear and come back pretty much straight away. Could be nice for trying to get around behind the opponent's army towards the end of the game, maybe. Next up, we've got Zoanthropes. In 9th edition, these guys went up to ludicrous points to give your entire army invul saves and also a torrent of mortal wounds out of them. In the Zoanthrope squad, you get 3 to 6 models in the unit, 1 Eurothrope included in that. He's no longer a special character. Stats wise, they lost a wound like quite a few Tyranid things. They also lost 1-inch move, so they are a bit more slow and ponderous. For their damage output, rather than just being flat mortal wounds now, they've got the Warp Blast with a choice of 2 different weapons. Either they can fire as an anti-elite sort of mode with D3 attacks and the blast keyword, hitting on a 3 with strength 7, AP 2 and damage D3, or they can focus their Warp Might into a single attack, again hitting on a 3, strength 12, AP 3 and damage D6 +1, and that's got the lethal hits keyword to help them out even more. Quite a nice generalist profile there. They can basically have mini las cannons, or quite a nice generalist anti-infantry profile with blast. Besides that, they've got a couple of special rules. The Neurothrope, if he's still alive, will allow you to potentially sap enemy leadership if they fail a battle shock test near you. The enemy squad takes D3 mortal wounds, and the Zoanthropes regain that many. Feels very situational, that one, to be honest, even with the ways that Tyranids can hand out battle shock. Not sure you really want these units right on the front line anyway. Otherwise, they've got a special rule called Warp Field, another aura durability boost that you could combine with Venomthropes, I guess. They give all their friendly Tyranids a 6+ invulnerable save if they're within 6 inches. Maybe not enormous for big tough things with a 3+ save or better, but with quite a lot of the army having a 5+ or 4+ save, that could be quite relevant against a few guns. Overall, I think they look kind of interesting. The ranged weapons are nice and general purpose and won't really have bad targets against anything. I guess there's always the possibility that they might well be paying a premium for that privilege though. Next up, and on to some gun squads. Biovores still have 1 to 3 models in their unit, and have interestingly picked up a small chance to explode now, having Deadly Demise 1. I guess that's what might happen if you shoot the things holding the spore mines too much. They've gained toughness 6, they still have 4 wounds, but kind of like the Zoanthrope profile, they've been changed from flat mortal wounds on the spore mine launchers to an actual attack profile. The spore mine launcher has D3 attacks with blast, so you could get a few more, hitting on a 4+, but with the heavy keyword, strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2. It's also got devastating wounds as well, so you still do have the chance for mortals, but only on a 6 to wound now. Overall, I think that isn't too bad. As a general purpose indirect fire profile, the mortal wound chance I think is particularly nice for giving you a small chance of just doing some damage no questions asked, and you also don't need a synapse unit to spot for them anymore, they can just fire out of line of sight as they could previously. Otherwise, if they don't fancy actually using their damage output, they can spawn some spore mines. Each model in the unit will just push out just 1 spore mine and throw it into the midfield. As we'll see later, spore mines basically stop a unit advancing too near them, and that could be really disruptive to an enemy advance. I feel like as a result, a couple of individual biovores could be really quite powerful to throw down those spore mines near the enemy. Between these guys and barb gaunts, you could be slowing the enemy by quite a lot. Pyrovores next, and these guys have got a very similar profile to the Biovores. Again, toughness 6 and lost 1 wounds down to 4 wounds rather than 5. Weapons wise, previously that Flame Spurt had 2 very different attack profiles. Now they're basically merged into a bit of a mid ground. D6 plus 1 attacks at strength 6, AP minus 1 and damage 1. They ignore cover now, auto hit, and they have the Twin Links rule, which does mean that they'll wound things that are a bit tougher a bit more easily. They'll still be odds on to wound even toughness 10 vehicles most of the time more than not. Like the Biovore, they have the small chance to explode when they die, and their special rule is that if they attack an enemy unit, then it can no longer receive the benefit of cover for the rest of that shooting phase. I guess could be interesting enough to fire first if you've got a whole load of other gunline nids to go. Next up, we've got the Hive Guard. These guys have gained a little bit of toughness now, up to toughness 7, and still get the choice between either the Impaler Cannon or the Shot Cannon. They seem to have flipped these round a little bit. The Shot Cannon is now the short-ranged one again, 24 inches, 2 shots hitting on a 3+, a strength 7, AP 1 and damage 3. Kind of okay as a profile, but seems a little lacking for such a big model. It's really going to be kind of interesting or kind of bad depending on whether or not your opponent brought any vehicles along. It's got the anti-vehicle 2+ keyword. Even with that though, you're going to be likely to average less than 1 successful wound on a vehicle per model firing. Certainly against any vehicles with a 2+ save, they'll struggle there. Otherwise, the ignores line of sight Impaler Cannon, like the Biovores, no longer needs a Synapse unit to spot targets for it. It's back up to 36-inch range, though its attacking profile has taken a bit of a nerf I think. It's now pretty much dedicated anti-infantry, rather than pretty much anti-everything as it was throughout much of 9th. Only strength 5, AP minus 1 and damage 1, worse strength, AP and damage all in one go. Finally, their special rule is called Defensive Stance. This one allows you a little bit more efficient overwatch out of the unit, hitting on a 5+ or even a 4+ if they're on an objective. Could mean that they could hit with some fairly punchy fire in the opponent's turn, though I feel that Overwatch is going to be a very in-demand stratagem that you might want to use on other units as well. Barb Gaunts look like they could be a truly disruptive unit out of the Tyranid Codex. New Gaunts standing on 3 legs with their biocannons, slowing down enemy units and dealing mass damage to infantry. Their defensive profile is kind of middling, toughness 4, a 4+ save and 2 wounds, a bit tougher than your standard Gaunts, but not too hard to put down with the right firepower. The biocannon's damage output looks interesting enough against light infantry, D6 shots with blast at 24-inch range, and heavy keyword as well for hitting on a 3+, all at strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1. Quite a lot of volume fire there, but with AP 0 they're not going to seriously threaten Space Marines all that much. By far the biggest thing for them is that they disrupt enemy movement. Each enemy infantry unit that gets hit by these gets -2 to move, advance and charge, and it does look like you only need to get hit by one of these each to slow each infantry unit down, so you could have one unit of Barb Gaunts slow down half an enemy army if they wanted to. For any elite enemy infantry army stomping up the boards towards the Tyranids, this is really bad news. It could be pretty game changing to keep a massive investment Terminator unit, for example, out of the fight for a turn while you focus on other things. Finally, for Tyranid squads, before we get into monsters and things, we have the Rippers, fun new models alongside the new Termagants, 3 to 6 models per unit, and still fairly small and squishable, now with toughness 2, a 6+ save, though 4 wounds, so you're going to at least need a fair few attacks. Interestingly, their objective control 0, though they do have a special rule that reduces enemy objective control as well if they're within engagement range of one of their units. I guess in theory it could mean that you could pair Rippers with one of your units to hold the objective and reduce enemy units that are trying to take it as well, but I think in reality that's a little bit unlikely to happen for various reasons. You're banking on the Rippers making combat, the enemy not dying, and the enemy not killing the Rippers either. Otherwise, they won't really be doing all that much damage, a few attacks at either strength 2 in combat or strength 3 with their spine moors if you upgrade to them, and they can still deep strike as well. I suppose they could be disruptive, but with little objective taking and not really able to deal much real damage, I think they're going to be a bit on the underwhelming side. Monsters next, and first up we have the Hungry Haruspex, a big tough monster with toughness 11, 14 wounds and a 3+ save, and this thing just wants to surge forward to melee and eat things. In combat, in 9th edition it was kind of okay, now I'd argue it's had really quite a massive improvement. It gets a crazy 14 attacks with that Ravenous Maw at strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2, but now you can also attack with the Shoveling Claws as well as the Maw rather than instead of it, all at strength 14, AP 2 and damage D6 +1. A pretty fantastic generalist profile that's going to ruin just about anything, a huge amount of attacks to deal with hordes, backed up by a few really good quality ones that'll chew through vehicles really quite quickly. This thing just seems massively more destructive than it was. Otherwise, it's still got that fun sniper tongue profile, a single attack at damage d6 plus 1, and its special rule is that if it kills an enemy unit, then it causes battle shocks to enemy units within 6 inches. To me, that one just feels like it's going to be a bit niche on the practical side of things, as it's likely to be doing that within your fight phase. So I guess the main disadvantage to the enemy is just not using stratagems within that fight phase, and then the battle shock just heals anyway in their next command phase. Still though, just for raw damage output alone, this thing looks really quite impressive. I don't think there's many units in the game that'll comfortably be able to tank that kind of damage. Next up, we've got the Burrowing Trigon and Morlock. As I mentioned earlier, with the Trigon itself, it is now just the regular Trigon. The Trigon Prime has basically been removed. Statline wise, its base stats are broadly kind of similar. Tyranid monsters seem to have an objective control somewhere around 3 to 5, and as with before, it gets to hit with its bioelectric pulse that is now 6 shots at strength 5 AP 0, but has picked up sustained hits too. Its melee though I think does look better than it was before. It gets 12 attacks hitting on a 3+, all at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3. Again, perhaps similar to the Haruspex, this is a lot more general purpose than quite a lot of stat lines we've seen in 10th edition. Perhaps best at killing things like Terminators, though just with the sheer volume of attacks that it gets, it should threaten tanks and vehicles as well. It does seem that the Trigon and the Morlocks have lost any tail type attacks though. Its special rule is called Subterranean Tunnels. This one allows it to arrive within 3 inches of enemy units, though it is at the cost of charging. I suppose if your opponent has screened super well and you still want to deep strike it, this could be really disruptive to have it come up somewhere that your opponent just can't deal with it very easily next turn. Or I guess potentially even do a cheeky objective snatching maneuver, taking a point off something with low objective control, maybe helping out with that bioelectric pulse. I feel like perhaps the best use of that super close deep strike though might be rapid ingress. Have it turn up in a problematic place for your opponent's units really close in their turn, and then get a basically automatic charge in yours. You just need to put it somewhere where they can't kill it in their turn first. Looks interesting enough though, certainly very scary if you did want to invest the extra command point in rapid ingress. Its counterpart the Morlock also looks a little bit more dangerous as well. Its melee attack has been buffed again. It still gets a truly ridiculous amount of attacks at 16, hitting at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 1, will chew through hordes very well, and not bad against elite infantry either. It gets that distensible jaw attack as well. That one's now got a bit more of a standard profile. 1 attack hitting on a 3+, strength 5, AP 0 and damage 3, but gets anti-infantry and devastating wounds, so a pretty reasonable chance for 3 mortals if you're fighting enemy troops. Finally, its Terror from the Deep rule means that each time this unit is set up on the battlefield by a deep strike, you roll a d6 for each enemy unit within 12 inches of it. On a 2 to 4 they take d3 mortal wounds, on a 5+ they take 3 mortal wounds and must take a battle shock test as well. Depending on how the opponent lays out their models, that could actually affect a fair few enemy units there. I guess the dream might be if your opponent has put something like 5 odd units that you can reach within 12-inch range, you could potentially be doing a serious amount of damage before it even tries to make combat. I guess the only negative might be that you might have the chance of killing enemy units, so it makes its charge range longer and it can't charge out of deep strike anymore. Next we've got the Maliceptor. This guy's toughness 11 and lost a wound from 15 to 14. Again kinda similar though with his 4+ invul save intact. His damage output with his buckets of mortal wounds and psychic casts has been replaced by Psychic Overload. This one's a single attack that's a fairly punchy ranged attack, d6 plus 3 shots, hitting on 3s, strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3. That one looks pretty solid against medium armor and things like Space Marine Terminators. Seems very nice, though perhaps not quite the mortal wound monstrosity that it was before. Otherwise it's got similar sort of style melee attacks with a sweep mode and a strike mode. The strike mode d6 plus 1 damage. Its special rule is Encephalic Diffusion. Rather than protecting nearby Tyranids now, this one now debuffs enemy units themselves when they're near the Maliceptor. People within 6 inches get a -1 to hit, and also if they happen to be below half strength, they're a -1 to wound as well. That seems to be at range and melee, and I feel like it's perhaps going to most often come up as just a bit of melee defense for the Maliceptor when they try and charge in and kill it. -1 to hit is pretty handy there, -1 to wound is pretty useful if it happens. The Toxicrin and its many tentacles are also toughness 11. This one's lost its -1 to hit in melee, and both its range and its combat attacks with its toxic lashes have had their profile tweaked a bit. They all hit at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2 now, with the anti-infantry 2+ keyword for easy wounds there. Certainly if you can get a Toxicrin anywhere near enemy infantry, it's going to make a bit of a mess. Between its 2 attack profiles, it should average around about 15 hits at that profile on the squad. The anti-infantry keyword will mean it's a lot less effective against things like mounted units and monsters though. Otherwise it still prevents fallback on a 3+ still. That could be quite disruptive, but the opponent will still be able to shoot the Toxicrin, what with the new big guns never tire rules, maybe just a little bit less powerful than it was. Otherwise it's got its hypertoxic miasma damage. This has been shifted to the movement phase from the end of the fight phase. I feel like perhaps that's a little bit more useful for it. Again, it's another way of dealing some damage at close range. An aura of mortal wounds, potentially giving you a chance to go all the way up to d6 mortal wounds on the roll of a 6. Unless it's kind of cheap, I can still see it being kind of niche. It's very anti-infantry focused, and your opponent isn't even guaranteed to have any if they're taking loads of mounted things or you're playing against knights or something. Next up, we've got the entry for the new Tyranid Psychophage, a very hungry, psychic-eating beastie from the Leviathan box set. This one's a bit more of a light monstrous creature, toughness 9, 10 wounds and a 3+ save, though in reality it's not going to be all that much easier to kill than the big stuff, as it gets a 5+ feel no pain baked in. Weapons wise, again it's kind of anti-infantry focused, similar to the Toxicrin, a heavy flamer sort of profile with its Psychoclastic Torrent, hitting at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1. And then its melee is a bit on the random side, d6+1 attacks, hitting on a 3, strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2. It does have devastating wounds on a 6, but really if it can it wants to get into enemy psychic casters, as you'll get those mortal wounds on a 2+ there rather than just a 6. Otherwise it's got a couple of special rules. Feeding Frenzy means that you get to add 1 to your hit roll against anything that's lost wounds. If it's below half strength you get +1 to wound as well. Pretty handy, but I don't think it's going to make it an outstanding damage dealer even so. And then it's also got a defensive special rule as well. Its biostimulus means that when friendly Tyranids units are within 6 inches, those units have a 6+ feel no pain. It's kind of interesting that you could have this thing, some Zone Thropes and some Venom Thropes maybe. That would layer a whole load of defensive rules on your Tyranids army, benefits of cover, invul saves, feel no pain and -1 to hit. That's quite a lot of ways of protecting a Tyranid advance if you put them together. Next up, we've got the trusty living battering ram that is the Carnifex. Previously, you'd filled these guys in a brood of 1 to 3 and then they'd split up. Now apparently they're a unit of 1 to 2 models that work together, and what's more, it's kind of fun as old One Eye can even join them now, so you can actually shield him from harm as he moves up the board. Looks like this datasheet rolls in the Thornback datasheet, as that's just not really a thing anymore, that the Screamer Killer of course got its own model. These guys aren't battle line though, so I guess it means that you can have up to 6 standard Carnifexes within most armies, plus 3 Screamer Killers, and I guess old One Eye if you're going maximal Carnifex. The datasheet's still a very hefty one. The old one was kind of ridiculous to be honest in 9th edition with the sheer amount of options that you had. It does look like a few of the more peripheral ones have gone though. The tail options basically just don't exist anymore, as with the Trigons, and also fairly popular upgrades like Spore Cysts and Enhanced Senses have also gone away as well, and Carnifexes do hit on 4s at both range and in melee now. Otherwise, toughness wise, they're a little bit easier to kill. They still kept their 2+ save, but they lost the -1 damage and have lost a wound. They have gone up to toughness 9, though I feel that's kind of equivalent compared with where they'd be in 9th. Weapons wise, both the Heavy Venom Cannon and the Stranglethorn Cannon have both been toned down really quite a lot. The Heavy Venom Cannon isn't 3 shots anymore, it's D3, and went down to lower AP and lower damage as well. Definitely feels like far less of a premier anti-tank weapon now. It'll be wounding a bunch of vehicles on 5s. The Stranglethorn Cannon is kind of similar as well, not really quite as punchy with strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2. Otherwise the Devourers and the Despitters are kind of similar to how they were. You can still take the Bioplasma attack if you want to, plus Spine Banks as well for a little bit of extra shooting. And his new melee profile basically gives you the choice of being anti-elites or true anti-tank with the Carnifex Crushing Claws. It's either a flurry of attacks at strength 9 damage 3, or just 4 of them at strength 12 and damage d6+1. Those attacks are going to be a lot less reliable though, now he's hitting on a 4. Finally, the Carnifex special rules are kind of interesting with Blistering Assault. This one sort of feels kind of similar to the Blood Surge rule for the Khorne Berserkers, where basically if these guys get shot and they lose any wounds from it, they get to move directly towards the nearest enemy unit by d6+2 inches. They are even allowed to finish an engagement range if they want to, so that could be one way of propelling them into combat. I guess it wouldn't stop your opponent from shooting at them still, due to big guns never tire, but still that could be pretty massive if your opponent underestimates them and leaves a unit too close. I'd not be too surprised if they went down in points a fair bit with this though, hitting on 4s is a bit of a nerf. Next up, for the small variant on the regular Carnifex, we've got the Screamer Killer, now with his rather brutal looking new model. This guy comes with a couple of extra wounds compared with the regular beast, and he just gets the one set of attacks with 10 attacks at strength 10, AP -2 and damage 3. Definitely a bit more focused than the regular Carnifex is. He also hits on 3s as well rather than 4s, another mark in his favour I suppose. Besides that, he gets his Bioplasmic Scream at 18-inch range. This hits on a 4+ at strength 8 and AP -2. Not bad for frying a bit of elite infantry, but also he has a Death Scream rule as well, which means that if you target a unit and you get a hit with it, it triggers a -1 leadership battle shock test on the enemy, which is a very reliable way of handing one out. Could be one way of preventing an enemy infantry units from interrupting in combat, I suppose. Looks pretty brutal and fairly easy to use in game, reasonably tanky and a lot of damage. The Exocrines had a few stats slightly shifted around. His lost his 2+ save going to a 3+, lost a wound to 14, but gained a little bit of toughness going to toughness 10, still a little bit lower than a few of the other Tyranid monsters though. His great big bioplasmic cannon still shoots at 36 inches, d6+3 attacks hitting on a 3+, strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3. On average that will be losing a few shots, it's lost a pip of AP, but it does both have the blast and the heavy keyword, both of which will amp up its damage in their own way, depending on whether he's static or if he's firing at hordes. His special rule means that if you target an enemy unit with his shots, then if the other Tyranid units in your army are making ranged attacks against it, they get to reroll a hit roll of 1 in the shooting phase. I guess that's quite nice if you've got a big Combine's armed shooting army. You can mark your targets and then you can fire with other things. Could be kind of nice if you had more than one Exocrine on the go as well, I suppose. For the even bigger Gumbug, we've got the Tyrannifex. He's still a big and hefty beast, a massive toughness of 12, so the biggest out of any of the ones of the Codex datasheets here. Still got 16 wounds and his 2+ save. As if that weren't enough though, he also has -1 damage built in, really quite a rare rule within 10th edition 40k. And currently for this, neither his rules nor the core rules prevent him from reducing the damage down to 0, means that he's effectively immune to damage 1 weapons unless Games Workshop FAQ something. Even so, it's a nice durability boost, great against damage 2, and helpful against heavier stuff as well. Otherwise, a few profiles have been fiddled around a little bit with his weapons, but they still do broadly the same thing. The acid spray is the same but lost a bit of AP. The Flesh Borer Hive lost a bunch of shots, but also picked up heavy sustained hits 1 and twin linked. Quite a nice mix of damage boosting keywords there that should have them hitting fairly hard. Still not going to do much against things with high saves though, being AP 0. The Rupture Cannon still very scary against tanks and vehicles. Just the 2 shots now with a heavy keyword, so hitting on 2s if static. Strength 18, AP 4 and damage 2d6. Not enormously different to its previous profile though. Next up we move on to the Tyranid Flyers. Both the Harpy and the Hive Crone have picked up the new flyer rules for 40k, basically a move of 20 inches or more, and they've got the hover keyword, so they've got the option of either starting on the board and just capping their movement at 20 inches, or starting in strategic reserve and continuing to zoom around very quickly. Looks like they really don't have any -1 to hit anymore, it's not in the core rules and it doesn't appear to be here. Statline wise they're up to toughness 9, but have lost a wound, probably a bit easier to kill overall given the loss of the -1 to hit as well. Its guns picked up the new twin linked, a bit less firepower overall, but a bit more effective against heavy hitters. Overall, I would say is a lot less impressive looking as a damage dealer now. The Venom Cannon and the Stranglethorn Cannon both got toned down quite a bit in terms of raw output, and Twin Links no longer flat doubles the shots, so it's a bit of a come down from his main weapons. Interestingly, his bomb ability does seem to have been slightly boosted though. If you can fly over an enemy unit, then you get to roll 6 dice, and for each roll of a 3+ they get a mortal wound. Solid threat against both hordes and heavies there, and then he's got the option for spawning spore mines once more. Now they no longer cost any reinforcement points or anything, just like the biovores, and he'll spawn D3 of those. I guess at least he's got the option of starting on the board once more, but the Harpy does feel like he's a lot less threatening than previously. The Hive Crone broadly got similar sort of fly type changes to the Harpy. Its shooting is a bit of an interesting mix of anti-infantry and anti-vehicle. The dual cannon's basically the same, with 2d6 auto hits at strength 6 -1, and the tentaclids have been reinterpreted at strength 7 AP 0 damage 2, but with anti-vehicle 4+ and devastating wounds for those mortals. In combat, as well as the scything wings with the damage 2, he also gets an attack with his thorax spur, a single attack at strength 10 AP 3 and damage d6 with anti-fly and extra attacks. Next up, let's take a look at some Spore Units, Spore Mines, Mucolids, the Spore Assist and the Tyrannicides. It'll be interesting to see whether Spore Mines actually wind up being worth taking in actual units of their own at all. You get 3 to 6 models in the unit, but it might just be better to have units like Biovores just throw them out over the board, as opposed to actually buying the units themselves. It seems that they set up by Deep Strike, drifting down onto the battlefield, I guess usually from turn 2 onwards. Otherwise for the mines, they remain super easy to kill at toughness 1, they still do a little bit of damage if you get too close to them, an average of 1 mortal wound each time a spore mine is within 3 inches of an enemy model. But I feel like the most important thing about the datasheet now is that they prevent enemy advance moves anywhere within 6 inches of them. They're not allowed to either start an advance move or end one anywhere within that range. That could genuinely be very annoying for opponents trying to move up the board. Have a few of these in the midfield somewhere, trying to talk them out of the way. They won't be able to advance anywhere near as quickly. And to be fair, you could even do this even if the spore mines weren't hidden at all, as the movement phase happens before shooting. Kind of feels like for that reason alone, something like a single Biovore might be a pretty decent include in an army, if just for that. Against the right army, that could slow down quite a lot of enemy units by forcing them to either have to go around the mine or not make their advance move. The Mucolids are the slightly bigger spore mines, a little bit more toughness with 3 wounds at toughness 4. Broadly you get a very similar offering here though, the same advanced disruption but just in one big model rather than in multiple little ones. Their damage output is a bit toned down though, they only average D3 mortal wounds now. I'd be kinda surprised if they wind up being particularly efficient to buy in for the board for damage purposes. The Spore Assist is the Tyranid fortification that can spawn some spore mines. This one does seem to work a fair bit differently to how it did before. It's a toughness 10 fortification type thing with a 3+ save, at least reasonably hard to destroy off the battlefield without anti-tank weapons there, and now its main purpose seems to be its bioweapons that it can fire out. It's got a consolidated profile with them, but can just keep on blazing away at the enemy even in their turn. The bioweapons profile gives you 5 shots hitting on a 4+, strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2, and a 24-inch range. You can fire with them during your own turn, or you can choose to swap that out for spawning a Mucolid spore. That one gets thrown out at somewhere within 18 inches. But you also get to fire those ranged weapons in your opponent's turn every time an enemy unit makes a normal advance or fallback move within range of the weapon, or even get set up on the board within range. Each time they do that, you can shoot with the Spore Assist as if it were your shooting phase, and you can do so up to 4 times per phase there, so I guess maximally that's up to 20 shots in the enemy's turn. Kind of an interesting little disruptive unit that. The guns aren't going to be a massive threat to a lot of big enemy heavy hitters, particularly really big single units, but for more fragile armies like say Eldar or Genestealer Cult, that could be kind of annoying. I guess line of sight might be a bit of an issue for it. It will have to set up in your own deployment zone now, as opposed to in the midfield, and it doesn't get deep strike or anything like that. For the Tyranid drop pod dedicated transport, we have the Tyrannicides. This thing now toughness 9 and 10 wounds with a 3+ save, basically functioning similarly to how it did before. It transports up to 20 Tyranid infantry models, so it can have a pretty big swarm. Anything with more than 1 wound takes up 3 spaces, or it can transport a Tyranid monster with a wound characteristic of 12 or less. As before, it can drop them down turn 1, basically getting an alpha strike by jumping them out of the pod right from the first turn, and otherwise then it can just be a bit of a nuisance, floating around the board with those flensing whips killing some medium infantry maybe. And it's got the same consolidated weapon profile as the Spore Assist, but you don't get to fire these in your opponent's turn, they just chip away at the enemy a little bit. I feel like putting the weapons together maybe is a little bit more sensible, rather than just having arbitrarily very powerful guns like all those venom cannons, but hitting on a dreadful ballistic skill. Finally we're into HQs and characters for the swarms. First up we have the Winged Hive Tyrant, certainly a bit of a terror of 9th edition, winging around with the Reaper of Obliterax. Looks like at least at the moment he's not got any bodyguards that can keep him safe, he can't join Tyrant Guard or anything, though I guess arguably his defensive profile might have been upgraded a little bit. It's gone from a 3+ save to a 2+ save, toughness 7 to toughness 9, he's still got his nice 4+ invul save, though he has lost a couple of wounds. Seems maybe like a pretty sensible one to put that 5+ feel no pain enhancement on. Otherwise for his stat line he is moving a fair bit slower, his movement has dropped down to 12 inches from 16, and that is quite a drop compared with the fairly crazy movement he had before. Otherwise for his weapons, as with the Carnifexes, the Heavy Venom Cannon and Stranglethorn are a bit weaker I think. I guess 10th edition Blast might help them out a little bit. His Bone Sword now picked up the Twin Links rule, that should help him out against the heavier stuff, so strength 9 re-rolling all wounds. Otherwise they've got the option of trading out the attacks for monstrous Scything Talons, which interestingly give him the extra attacks, so I guess he'd be striking with those 4 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2, and would also get to attack with the Tyrant Talons at the same time. So I guess you go with either the big 6 big hitting heavy Bone Sword attacks, or effectively 9 strength 7 damage 2 attacks. I'd guess probably the Bone Sword would win out overall against most targets, but it won't be quite as good against infantry. Finally, for Hive Tyrant things, it looks like he brings a particularly nice rule called Will of the Hive Mind. Once per turn, one friendly Tyranid unit within 12 inches can use a stratagem for 0 CP, and can do so even if another unit has used it. Feels kind of similar to the Space Marine Captain one, that one. Really quite a big rule that's pretty powerful to have in your army, though I feel like it might be a bit better on a walking tyrant behind some hive guard to keep it a bit safer perhaps. Finally, for his psychic power, he gets paroxysm. He does have the chance to basically have perils with this and take some mortal wounds himself, but if you roll a 2+, then you can basically debuff an enemy units by giving them -1 attacks. That could be quite big, particularly against enemy units with just 3 or 2 attacks, but really quite good ones. Overall still seems dangerous. It's maybe going to be a bit more vulnerable to enemy guns though, with not being able to be shielded as well. Otherwise, for his walking counterpart, really quite a lot of his stats are the same. Interestingly, rather than having a big durability boost compared with the winged one now, he only really gets the extra pip of toughness now. They both have the 2+ save and 10 wounds. Otherwise, no enormous changes compared with him and the Flyrant. Obviously he moves a bit slower, and the only other major thing that he gets is he swaps out Paroxysm for Onslaught. This one's a rather good aura which allows friendly Tyranid units within 6 inches to get the assault keyword on their ranged weapons, meaning that they're going to be quite manoeuvrable, zooming around the board, and maybe getting closer to melee while they shoot. Overall, I feel like he does seem pretty helpful to have in the middle of a battle line, surrounded by some hive guard. Keep those 3 stratagems safe, get your gun line a bit more mobility, and also blaze away with a big gun and still not give up your dangerous melee. For his unique character Epic Hero Alternative, we've got the Swarm Lord. Again, he can attach to the Tyrant Guard, though he brings some quite different rules to the table. His melee is a bit better than the other Hive Tyrants, striking at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3 with 8 attacks and twin linked. He gets a psychic shooting attack instead of a psychic buff. Synaptic Pulse hits a unit at 18 inches, with basically d6+3 heavy bolter hits with Torrent. The Swarm Lord does give some pretty godly command point manipulation though. Each turn he just generates you 1 command point for your army, no questions asked. Very nice on top of your standard one. He debuffs 1 crucial enemy stratagem, making it an extra command point cost for the entire rest of the game. It does look like it can be the command point reroll as well, which is kind of huge. And on top of that he also gets 9-inch synapse as well, so a little bit more helpful to have in the centre of your army. Feels like if you really wanted, you probably could have a Swarm Lord and a regular Hive Tyrant. Their command point abilities kind of complement each other a bit. Might be a bit on the high investment side though, and you'd probably need to get both of them a unit of Tyrant Guards to protect them. Lastly, for the Hive Tyrants, we also have the new entrant on the block, the Neuro Tyrant. This guy from the Leviathan box seems to be a little bit easier to kill than the other Hive Tyrants, only toughness 8, 9 wounds and a 4+ save, though again he does get the 4+ invul. He's got the option for a different bodyguard as well to attach to some Neuro Gaunts, so it has the potential to take up residence in a horde of chaff as opposed to just some big tanky individual warriors. For his own personal attack, I must admit it's not the most exciting in the world. The main thing that he does is Psychic Scream, basically a torrent attack with 2d6 hits at strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2. Definitely not too bad against things like standard Space Marines, but not really all that exciting against heavy stuff. Interestingly, unlike the other Hive Tyrants, he actually gives a damage buff to his unit though. If he's leading a unit, then each time a model in the unit makes an attack, you get to add 1 to the hit roll, and if the target's battle shocks, then add 1 to the wound roll as well. That could actually make a unit of Hive Guard really quite significantly fighting. You might need to think about one of the Tyranid ways to hand out Battle Shock though, maybe trying to scream the enemy unit with a Screamer Killer before charging them. Otherwise though, he does some helpful things with the core Tyranid army rules. He's got Flexible Synapse, which allows you to cast it on 2 different units in the command phase. Basically put it on 2 units within 12 inches and then they can move away and still happily be within Synapse, though it does mean that that buff would fade before your next Battle Shock test step, so it's mainly going to be useful just for units that remain within 12 inches of him. Perhaps the most sinister thing that it does though is a -1 debuff to the whole board Battle Shock that Shadow in the Warp does. On the turn when you make your entire opponent's army test Shadow in the Warp, he'll give you a -1 to that test. On a decent sized enemy army, that could definitely mean that you have maybe 2 or 3 other units fail Battle Shock across the board. Could be quite a big deal. Overall, certainly doesn't seem bad to have in the army. Perhaps seems like a particularly interesting leader choice for the Tyrant Guard as it actually makes them fight a bit harder. Will be interesting to see where the points for this thing works out on. The Shadow in the Warp debuff is quite nice, but his own damage and defense aren't the most exciting in the whole world compared with the other Hive Tyrants. Next up, we've got the Brood Lord, a leader that can attach to Gene Stealers only. He gets the scout move like them, And he does get Leadership 7, though he's rather interestingly not a Synapse character anymore, so he's not going to be broadcasting your High Fleet buffs through him. Statline wise, he's still a bit of a generalist. Okay defense for an infantry character, I guess, a toughness 5, 6 wounds, and a 4+ invul. And his melee attacks also feel pretty similar to how they were before, rerolling the wound roll and getting extra AP on 6s, this time with a form of devastating wounds. Otherwise though, if he is leading some Gene Stealers into the fray, his vicious insight can allow the other Gene Stealers to also get devastating wounds on their claws. That's quite nice if they're trying to clear an objective with full wound rerolls, and he also gives a -1 debuff to hit for an enemy unit within engagement range, so another handy melee thing there. Will be interesting to see if he's cheap enough to make him worth it. He definitely feels like a bit of a nasty damage dealer, though one that's not really all that hard to gun down if he is scouting forward and getting himself exposed to enemy fire. Next up, we've got the big tough termagant spawner that is the Tervigon. Still a great big tough tanky monster with 16 wounds, toughness 11 and a 2+ save. Again, could be a very interesting one to put that feel no pain enhancement on. That's just going to make it absolutely through the roof durability wise. Probably something that's for the best, seeing as this thing looks like it can no longer hide behind a swarm of gaunts anymore. Weapons perhaps don't generally tend to be the main event for this one, but it lost a little bit of AP on the Stinger salvos, and then as before it can either take claws or talons, with the option of whether or not you want a bit more of an anti-horde mode at a bit of a cost of damage against tanks. The rate of spawning gaunts has been decreased a little bit. You only get D3+3 termagants replenished to a unit now, and I'm afraid it no longer gets a big unit of termagants basically preloaded into it to allow you to spawn them out in the first battle round. I guess as a result though, its points cost might go down a bit if it's not effectively carrying around a bunch of free gaunts inside it. Finally, its Brood Progenitor rule allows it to give a bit of a boost to nearby termagants. Broods within 6 inches get lethal hits on their attacks, both range and melee. Not too bad for a regenerating horde to just chip away at the enemy a little bit, even if their attacks are AP 0. Next, we're back to the Leviathan box again with the Winged Tyranid Prime. It looks like he's the only version of Tyranid Prime that you can field now that's an independent character. A bit weird that they stopped the other one from leaving the Tyranid Warrior unit. I kind of wonder if they might come out with a model for a Tyranid Prime as a result. The Winged Prime can either lead Gargoyles or the Tyranid Warriors of either flavour. He gives the unit sustained hits 1, which is maybe just a little bit awkward seeing as the Gargoyles aren't particularly great damage dealers, and the Tyranid Warriors will be a lot slower than he is. I guess it doesn't really hurt though. It's not really all that tough to kill. He doesn't get an invul save, just a 4+ regular save and 6 wounds, and I feel like his melee is a little bit on the disappointing side as well. 6 attacks at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2. Not exactly a profile that the Tyranid's army really seems to be lacking for all that much. Maybe 1 or 2 dead intercessors, or almost a Space Marine Terminator. I guess he must have rolled kind of well in that animated trailer. Otherwise, his second special rule is called Death Blow. He's got a 4+ chance to fight in death and go down swinging if he is killed in combat. Maybe might kill another infantry or 2, but still it's not the most exciting melee profile in my opinion. Next up, we've got the brutal regenerating Carnifex that is Old One Eye. Kind of an interesting shift from his datasheet in that he's a leader that can attach to other Carnifexes now. Kind of fun that they can actually tank for him as a bit of a squad and actually help him reach combat. Statline wise, he's 9 wounds, so +1 from the regular Carnifex, -1 from the Screamer Killer. Doesn't have the -1 damage, but he specifically gained a 5+ feel no pain, so he will be a bit tougher than your average Carnifex. He does regenerate as well, regenerating D3 lost wounds at the start of each command phase. Kind of fun that that's both turns as well, means that if your opponent shoots him but doesn't quite kill him, he'll have 2d3 wounds regenerated by the time they get to attack him again. In combat, he hits unsurprisingly hard, 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6 +1, or trades it out for an anti-horde sweep mode. He has dropped down to weapon skill 3+ from weapon skill 2+, but at least while he's leading a unit you get to reroll the hit roll. That seems kind of big for the Carnifexes that now hit on a 4+. Next up, we've got the Parasite and Mortrex, which even in the new edition doesn't appear to be epic hero or anything. Looks like despite being a kind of named character, you can still take more than one if desired. As with Lictors, he also is lone operative with a stealth keyword for -1 to hit at range, kind of hard to catch up with, and you can't shoot him within 12 inches. He is a bit slower than he was though, with 12 inches rather than 16, lost a wound, and is no longer -1 to hit in melee or prevents rerolls anymore, so overall he is just a bit easier to kill bar the lone operative thing. His melee is a little bit anti-infantry with just strength 5 and damage 1, and then he makes one attack with that barbed ovipositor. That one wounds infantry on a 3+, AP 2 and damage 3, and if it successfully kills an enemy infantry model you get to spawn out some rippers, D3 bases set up near to the model. Kind of handy to have around, though I must admit they're going to be a little bit less useful now they can't take objectives and things. Otherwise, he's got a rule to cause a battle shock test for one unit that he's in engagement range with, yet another way that Tyranids have to hand that out. Maybe it doesn't look super exciting unless it's really quite cheap. I feel like losing the movement is a bit of a shame, as he was extra nice to fly around quite that fast. Finally, we've got the character Lictor that is Death Leaper, an epic hero and can't be a warlord, but given the differences that he had to Lictor's last time round, he's actually kind of similar now. Very similar damage attacks with precision. The only major stat line difference is a +1 wounds. Otherwise, his main trade off is that he lacks that pheromones type rule, but instead he gains a rule called Fear the Unseen. Again, this one's another battle shock thing. When an enemy unit's within 6 inches of the model, it debuffs the leadership by -1. In addition, if it's still there in the command phase, then the opponent has to take a battle shock test for their units if they're just below starting strength. It doesn't actually matter if they're below half. It's interesting enough, but I guess I kind of hope that he wouldn't be too different to a standard Lictor with that kind of rule. Feels like it's kind of similar sort of utility. In any case, pretty interesting to take a look through one of the new indexes for Warhammer 40k. Pretty fun to see some big special rules in play. I feel like things like the Barb Gaunt's movement debuff, plus the Spore Mines turning off advances seems like quite a nasty combo for just shutting down enemy movement really easily. Can't help but think that that's going to be pretty strong, and maybe have some units of your own in the midfield to take objectives early. I feel like the Tyranids in general kind of similar to the Leviathan box set, just maybe don't really have all that many strong options for high AP, high damage attacks. Bar their lethal hits specialization against vehicles, I feel like there's just quite a lot of units that just really aren't going to do all that well against armor. Even previous anti-tank weapons like the heavy venom cannon seem to be a bit more mid-strength now. Obviously can't really weigh up the army too much without points costs out. It'll be interesting to take a look at those when they drop. Let me know which units you're most keen to see in action at the moment though. There's really quite a lot of fun stuff and special rules in play here. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Tyranids in time. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support there. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.